Salutations and welcome. Today we're going to be taking a look at Vergil's second Ecloga, lines 23 through 27. But first, last time in Vergil's Ecloga. Here is our rubric, everything that we look for as we go through the text. Let's get started. Canto quae solitus, si quando armenta vocabat, amphion der caius in actaio archintho, or arachintho, nec sum adeo in formis, nuper me in litora vidi, cum placidum ventis staret mare, non ego Daphnin judice te, metuam, si numquam fallit imago. And there we go. Here we have our verb as the very first word, which is nice. We got that O there, easy to parse, so I'm not going to bother with it. This is a word from which we get cantillation, so I sing, and it wants to take a direct object, which we might have here with quae. Solitus, with that US right there, must refer back to Corydon, so that's going to be nominative, singular, masculine. Quae doesn't look like it has anything to refer to except perhaps what follows hereafter. AE as a nominative singular for the feminine doesn't make any sense since we haven't had a feminine for it to refer to. So then instead, accusative, plural, neuter, poorly written, as the object of canto makes the most sense, as far as I think anyway. And then solitus is off of the verb soleo, which then means that we have a fourth principal part, and we need to add in the perfect passive participle, and it means to be accustomed. So I sing what things I have become accustomed. Si quando is a special form here, the green and yellow, at least I think it was the green and yellow, so reminded me that after si we have ali, which can also be on quando, and it makes more sense, the ali quando rather than just plain old quando. So I'm going to stick that in there. And it means what time soever, any time, something along that. And it's referring to wokabat, which we have the familiar form, bot for third, singular, imperfect, active, and indicative, with a direct object in armenta, a right there, accusative, plural, neuter. We say, if at any time was singing, well, who was singing? We'll have to find out in a moment. Corydon would be first person, so must be talking about a different subject. Armenta, as I think we've spoken before, can mean herd or animals. Animals in the plural, of course, being herd singular. And then here we come to our subject of wokabat at last. As amphion, the O-N right there is going to be a Greek nominative singular and masculine. So this is the name of a hero that I think, and I'm not sure, I haven't read the tales of Amphion, so put a lot of salt into what I'm about to say. I think this is a hero that the Romans co-opted into their own mythology, as they did with everything. He became, and this is from the green and yellow, he became associated with Orpheus, and so this meant that much of the mythology surrounding Orpheus was adopted into the myth of Amphion, which concerns this a lot. Was calling the animals, that is a reference to something that Orpheus was able to do. He was able to charm animals, and so Amphion also becomes able to charm animals. But before we move on, what does Amphion mean? Again, not having read anything about Amphion prior to this, I can't say for certain, but I think Amphion, when put into Greek, would be this. I'm going to say that that one's more likely, because then we have two Greek words put together, and that will give us a meaning. On here would be from the present active participle being, and then amphi is a sort of preposition, which would give us the possible meanings for his name of the... trying to read my notes. It's very small writing. Could mean for the sake of, amphi, so the one who's being for the sake of, who's standing on behalf of others. Or it could mean the one who surrounds, being around. So I'm not very sure of the meaning of his name, but I would think that for a lot of these heroes, the name of the hero has something to do with some of the great deeds he's supposed to have done as a description of his character. And since I don't know the tales of Amphion, I can't say if something like that makes any sense. But moving on, Derkaios, we have US there to modify Amphion, and it has its own meaning. So there are two options that we could use for this. We could just translate it the Theban, which is what Amphion was, or we could say the Dirke punishing, because there was a character by the name of Dirkus, maybe? I'm not quite so sure. And Dirke had a brother, Lycus, and I guess they murdered Amphion's mother, and so Amphion and his brother Xanthus go and axe Dirke and Lycus, which is why he's called the Derkaios Amphion. So I'm going to write both of those down once we get to actually writing the whole thing down, as a description of who this guy is. Reading my tiny notes again. He is known for having rebuilt the wall of Thebes, supposedly with magical music. Again, a musical connection there with Orpheus. All right. Another bit to explain the entire line. In actio, correct form for both of these, of course, so our prepositional phrase ends there. This one's taking the ablative. Actio could be a archaic form of one of the names of Attic, like the region in Greece. Or it could be that it's just the Latin word for coastal, which I'll get to in a minute. Because coastal is, it's an adjective, so it'd be actios, actia, actium. But arakintho or arakintho are modifying actio, or maybe it's the other way around. It would probably be the other way around. And that limits the possible meaning of actio. This word, either spelling, refers to mountains. Specifically, we know that there was a mountain, possibly part of a range that was called the Aracinthan Mountains, or something like Aracinthan, and it was on the border between Attica and Boeotia. Boeotia is north of Attica, which means it's got a range. And not having been to Greece, I can't say for much certainty, but from what the green and yellow described, it doesn't seem that the mountains that this border would have made are close enough to the coast for actio to be the adjective coastal. Instead, it seems to be referring to something further inland. And then, and I don't have this written down, so apologies for the several weeks smudged memory here, there's the possibility that this could be referring back to the island that Corydon mentions that his sheep are on in the previous page that we translated. I don't think there is any hint that there was a mountain of that island named either of these, so that one's pretty unlikely. And besides, he's talking about Amphion's heroics, which were on mainland Greece, and of course, Corydon is not. So there we go. I'm going to go with this spelling as the one in my translation. I'm going to treat this rather than as coastlands. I'm going to treat it as Attic, the region. So then we have, if at any time he was calling the herd, specifically Amphion, the Dirkaian, the Theban, the Dirke punishing. So one final note on Arakenthus is the possible meaning of this word. It could be from the word Kinthus, which is the name of somebody. This is the name of somebody who's, I think it may have been a position, or maybe it's the name of a temple. I'm not clear. But it was somebody who was, in some way, it was related to prayers to Apollo. I should probably stop there before I muddle things up anywhere, but some way related to Apollo. Either one of his temples or an alternate name for him. So it's a mountain of Apollo. Moving on. Neck. I want to look for another one. So I don't see another neck in here, so this is just going to be, or I suppose it could go with the non. But I think I'm just going to leave it as a simple negative. So, negating sum, which we don't need to parse there. I am not. Adeo is a adverb, and it adds emphasis. But it also is a step back. We might almost say apologetic step back by Corydon from the pretension, which this first sentence here definitely was. I am not so very informis, is right there is going to be the nominative singular masculine of the adjective. And this one, as you can see, form in there. It can mean shapeless because in is negating form. Shapeless, deformed, horrid, or hideous. I'm not so very hideous or deformed. I think those two would make the best. Remember that Corydon is he's a outside laborer, so as he is currently young, he's got nice, beautiful, pinkish white skin, presumably pinkish white skin, and that's not going to stick around. He's constantly in the sun. So, talking about how he looks currently. New pair. This is a word newly, lately. May, that doesn't work. In, prepositional phrase there. Weedy, wrong form to fit in that. So this one takes the ablative, singular, and neuter. Widow, widere, weedy. So we've got the first person singular, just the third principal part. So lately, I saw. And then may, we have the two options of either ablatives or the accusative. Weedy takes the accusative, so that's what may must be. It can't be part of the prepositional phrase. I'm going to make it reflexive in English so it flows a little bit better. And then litore normally means shore, as in the first lines of the Aeneid, where you will see it. But in this case, I think he's saying shore in reference to like, the water outside of the shore. Because seeing himself has to be reflective. That word that I can't say right now. Might say, is shoals the right word? Not being a nautical person myself, I'm not so clear on the vocabulary for them. For what that would be. Maybe shallows. Comma. Cum, prepositional phrase. Possibly placidum is the incorrect ending right there, so this can't be a prepositional phrase. Instead, we have to have a subjunctive clause, a cum clause. Ventis wrong, staret. Here we have our et as an ending on the stem stare, which itself comes from sto stare. So we've got what looks to be a third singular imperfect active subjunctive, which makes sense with our cum. So we've got temporal, adversative, or it's temporal and circumstantial. Last video, was it last week? I don't know. It was either in the last John Latin video, talked about how I never remember which one uses subjunctive, between temporal and causal. Moving on. Adversative, when, or causative? I can't remember anything. Anyway. So we need a singular subject. Placidum could be, except it's an adjective. So there would have to be a neuter adjective referring to something uncertain. Ventis, that's the wrong form right there. So it's ventus, ventus. No, ventus, venti. Yeah, that's got to be it. So mare is the only other option, and it is a neuter, which fits with placidum. It's singular, and as our subject, it works. So nominative singular masculine, not masculine, neuter, nominative singular neuter. When tis is dative or ablative plural. What would we need a dative or ablative plural for? Well, what do we have going on here? So with our temporal or circumstantial, when sea stood, our adversative, although the sea stood, causal, because the sea stood. Cause for the preceding clause, that doesn't make sense. Adversative, although the sea stood, I saw myself. No. Instead, I think it's got to be either the circumstantial or the temporal. So when. But then what would we need a dative or ablative when for? If we had dative, we'd need to figure out, well, which of the uses of the dative. We've got normally indirect object. Well, we don't need an indirect object with this verb. So then what's the other option? Cause. Well, because of the wind, the sea stood still. Or the sea stood still. And that works. But if it were ablative, then we would have the option of means. The sea stood still by means of the wind. And frankly, either of those work. So we've got up to you, or whatever your professor says. Definitely go with what your professor says. Dative, ablative, or I suppose instrument, but you can't really wave it around in your hand. Anyway, means or cause. So then there's that clause. Moving on. Non-ego, so here we clearly have our subject. We don't need to parse it. Not a verb, not a verb, not a verb. And aha, metuam. Am right there is not a more normal ending for early Latin, but am is going to be either our first person singular future, or it's going to be our first person singular present subjunctive. And in order to determine that, we need to know which conjugation is the verb, and this is metuo, metuere, metui, and then I don't remember the fourth, probably metutum, metutum sum. That doesn't sound quite right. But anyway, since it is a third conjugation, it does take its future in es et emos et is ent, and its subjunctive. We beat a giant. Also, es et emos et is ent, except I think in the future you actually get macrons. So it could be either. Why would he want future, though? I myself will fear. That doesn't make any sense. So future is wrong, and it must be the present subjunctive. Because he's talking in the present tense. He's describing himself in the present. Well, that's past tense. But present tense aside in the past tense, returning again to describing himself. He's trying to argue with Alexis why Corydon is worth it. And going suddenly into the future for fears doesn't make much sense. Why would he fear in the future when fearing right now, which is exactly what he's dealing with, makes more sense. I hope my rambling argument there flowed properly. Anyway, so making sense of this. Going back to Daphne, we've got in right there, which normally we would want to take as an accusative, which it might be, depending on what's going on with eudicate. But we need to first determine what does Daphne mean. It's a name. The Greek name here is... And in the Greek, it ends in the sigma, which means the noon actually is the accusative form. So that just tells us what this should be. And the meaning of it is like a bayberry or a bay tree. Either of those is what Daphnis could mean. And of course, when you're talking about something like this word and the possible meanings, it's so old, we don't have, at least as far as I'm aware, we don't have any dictionary that has Daphnis, and then it's got a image of the bay tree, or it's got an image of the bayberry. So which it is, context usually will determine things like that. I don't know the context of Daphne, but it's being used and as a name of another. Running over my words. It's being used as the name of another Greek hero adopted by the Romans naturally, and he was a singing herdsman. And that's all I know about him. Anyway, so accusative. Metuam. Why would he be afraid of Daphnis? And why would the non be there? I am not afraid of Daphnis. Now that doesn't make much sense. So instead, something else must be going on. Going to eudike te. Eudike, here we have eudicus would be the noun. And I don't remember what the adjective form would be. But we've actually got a Latin colloquialism going on. When you pair eudike with a pronoun, it means by the pronoun's judgment. So you've got te, which is second person singular, and be by your judgment, specifically referring to Alexis. And so this, eudike, is in the ablative singular, and it's either masculine or feminine. At least that's what my notes say. I'll take my notes for the authority there. So by your judgment has to take an object, and we have that perfectly with Daphne. And then ego. Ego could be going with metuam, or it could be going in this phrase right here. But then it's in the wrong form, which is unusual. It must go in there, because the known can't go with metuam. It would break the sense of what's going on here. Corydon is doubting himself, and he's trying to argue for Alexis. And in this case, he appears to be arguing, or trying to argue from Alexis's point of view. It's eudike te. So, not by your judgment, a Daphnin, or Daphnis. Ego is just in the wrong form. This could be for poetic reasons, or it could be for added emphasis. I'm not sure. It could also be for clarity. Put it in ego rather than in me, because then me would mess with the reader. Well, which one goes with eudike, te, or me? A native Latin speaker would probably know very quickly, but a non-native Latin speaker might not. You would come across the me first, and then you have eudike. You're familiar or relatively familiar with the turn of phrase, and so automatically you think, not by my judgment, a Daphne, or Daphnis, are you? Which then changes everything that's going on here. Oh, hello, Phrygius. To something completely different. Corydon is speaking about himself. And now he's trying to, or what I'm arguing is he's trying to say how Alexis is thinking about, again, Corydon himself. And suddenly have a switch where it's now Corydon is judging Alexis doesn't make sense. So I think stylistic, possibly necessary ego for the flow of the sentence, but for clarity as well. I hope that made sense. Anyway, metuam is its own thing. So up to te is a judgment that Corydon imposes on Alexis. And then he's just saying, I fear that this clause is true. And of course we need to say may fear because of the subjunctive nature of the verb there, because he's talking about a hypothetical. He's not sure that that's what Alexis thinks. See, if, not is, if, nunquam, never, fallet, it right there, I'll get to that in a moment. Imago, imagonis, that is to say, is nominative singular feminine. So this is our subject, fall. It is what it looks like in English if you take out the it. To fall down, to trip, to lessen the idea but not the meaning. So, image. Whose image? Of course it's going to be referring to Corydon, because that's what he's been talking about. He's talking about his voice. He's been talking about his image right there and beforehand. So if, never, in brackets, period. Now, last thing before we're finally done. Follet has two other possible readings. Could be fall ot with an at or fall et with an et. This verb is fallo, fallere, feli, falsum. And normally, at least I'm guessing for the first two. The third and fourth principal part, got that from the lexicon. Normally when you have a verb that reduplicates, that's going to be... And now I'm questioning my own line of thought here. I'm used to seeing it being third, because kuro, kurere, kukuri, but then we've also got sto, stare, steti, which is a first, and do, dare, dedi, which is also a first. But those are irregular firsts. I presume then that the at would, if it is a third, then the at would be subjunction. If my image never falls, never may fall, which makes sense. Or it could be that the one of the copyists thought that follow was a first, so then at was the more correct, was the actual correct spelling for just an indicative. Et would be future if it were a third, if my image will never fall, which is also a fine way of reading it. And this reminds me, go back and correct myself, and I'll probably put a note in there to correct myself. Subjunctive that I was talking about earlier, it's not es, et, it's os, ot, ot is ont. For the third, I'm sorry, it's just the first that are identical. There will have been a note already warning him. Let's take a look at this in its own context, and I will set you free. I sing what things, having been accustomed to what things. If, whenever, Amphion Dirke punishing, in Attic Arakinthus, brackets mountains, was calling animals. So he's comparing himself to Amphion. I am not so very hideous. Lately I saw myself in shallows when sea stood still because of or by means of winds. Not I daftness by your judgment, I may fear, if my image never fails. And that sounds very choppy in English, but it does make some sense. And we've got posturing right here, and then we've got feeling a bit insecure about his argument. So of course he's going to be a bit scrambled like my brain always is. So at least I think the broken nature of this part of the argument makes some sense based on how he's handling things. Pretension, drawing back, self-pride, drawing back again, and fear. Anyway, this has been completely chaotic. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope that you have a very good day. Wale.